Okay, so it's all gone quiet, so I'll make a start. Firstly, good morning and welcome to the Hospital Club. Thank you for coming. I'm Chris Marjoram, MD of Rapport, and we're delighted that so many of you could have joined us this morning for the launch of our out-of-home effectiveness research study in association with the IPA, which we've modestly called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, so no pressure. Traditionally, out-of-home's greatest strength was building brands and creating brand fame, often in association with television. Today, in a world increasingly dominated by Google and Facebook, out-of-home is still brilliant at doing that, but increasingly it's seen as a way of amplifying digital and social. And today we want to talk to you about how out-of-home achieves that. Out-of-home has undergone more change in the last 5 years than in the previous 50. You can't help but notice the changing digital out-of-home landscape on our streets, on our railway stations, the underground, and our shopping malls. The media owners, many of whom are here today, are largely responsible for that and should be congratulated for having the vision, but also for, frankly, putting the investment into creating a digital out-of-home future. Where traditional media has struggled, out-of-home is actually thriving. The digital transformation in out-of-home, the ability to serve content dynamically, and also the enormous creative possibilities that we have with digital is actually only one side of the growth story. Data underpinned by Root, our audience measurement system, is also what's driving clients to out-of-home because of the accountability that it provides, but also because it's a safe and trusted environment from which to communicate from. But in the rush to look ahead, there's a temptation not to take stock and not to learn from the past. After all, regardless of how sophisticated our media world has become, it still comes back to one simple question. Has our communication worked? And more importantly, how can we improve in the future? And that is what today is all about, getting back to the basics of marketing effectiveness to understand how we can do even better and create even more rewarding connections in out-of-home. So we're very lucky to have Janet Hull with us today from the IPA. She's Director of Marketing Strategy, and she's going to help us answer that question. Janet.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. Thank you for inviting me. In the utopian 60s, in 1967, Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian academic with a fascination for all things marketing and comms, introduced the notion of a paradigm shift for advertising with the catchphrase, "The medium is the message." Or as he liked to pronounce it, "The medium is the message." It was apocalyptic at the time, as the creative and the idea had always held sway before then. Fast forward 40 years to 2007, and the first industry study by the IPA on the future of advertising and agencies, joint with the Future Foundation, and the emphasis had changed. No longer was the medium the message, now the new kid on the block was content, and the rallying cry was, "Content is king." If content was relevant and appealing, it was not contained by the medium, but travelled across space and time, propelled by influencers and consumers, the beginnings of the social revolution. Now cut 10 years on to 2017, and the words medium and content can appear to have been supplanted by the word data. Marketing effectiveness in the digital age appears to be all about data. Joining up the dots on data, generating insights from data, programmatic buying to match data, locational data, interactivity, it's all in the data. Why is this relevant to today? When thinking about my intro for this Rapport event, it struck me that all three of these catchphrases were relevant to the phenomenon which is out of home. Out of home, or as I still prefer to call it, outdoor, seems to have ridden every trend, unique among media channels, for allowing the medium to influence the message, for allowing content to be king, for allowing in the digital age for it to be all about the data. providing opportunities for both brand building and brand activation, long and short-term performance, in both a lead and a support role. Our most recent IPA Databank publication, joint with Google and Thinkbox, aptly titled Media in Focus, seeks to give a truthful overview of marketing effectiveness in the digital era when it comes to media. Its broad conclusions are that digital offers the potential for every medium to be both more efficient and effective in itself and in combination with other media, but challenges the industry to ask itself whether this potential has yet been fully realised. This new study from Rapport takes these initial findings and seeks to put the spotlight on out-of-home. How has out-of-home risen to the challenge, and what more can it do? It's been a pleasure to work with Paul Sambrook and the team at Rapport and Peter Field to bring it to fruition. I commend the findings to you and look forward to hearing the presentation. Thank you for inviting me.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. Oh, there you go. That's good for a research presentation. Excellent response. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I'm Paul. I'm the Marketing Director for Rapport. This is my colleague Ross. He's our Head of Insights. And we're really excited, obviously, to find and share these kind of learnings with you today. Now, having said that, just because I'm excited, I fully appreciate that a hardcore research presentation at 9 o'clock in the morning potentially is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. So we have concentrated, obviously, on the key findings for the study. As you will appreciate, though, I guess, with a topic as big and as large as this, there are a huge number of insights that we didn't obviously include in here, didn't make the final cut. So what I would encourage you all is that if you have any questions about out-of-home effectiveness after today's session, please do make contact with us, because it may very well be that we can answer some of those questions anyway. I'll also just flag now that we're going to do a Q&A at the end, so if we could just kindly ask you to hold any questions for us just until then, please. Thank you. So we recognise that today's marketeers are under more pressure than ever before when it comes to justifying their investment in media and really trying to actually prove almost an immediate payback to the business. I think with that in mind, we can clearly see why the short-termism that we see in advertising at the moment is actually here today, and we can also actually understand why there is an ever-growing move of money into digital channels with their promise of that quick and easy campaign measurement performance. Although, obviously, as the wider marketing world is clearly waking up to, quick and easy doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And I think with that point in mind, what we were really clear about with this study is that we wanted to understand out-of-home's role in driving hard business metrics, not just click-through rates, but actually something that was going to quantify the effectiveness of the channel. We also wanted to understand out-of-home's role in working in this changing media landscape that's becoming increasingly dominated by digital, and hence our theme today, standing on the shoulders of giants. Feel free for any social people, by the way. We've got a little hashtag there, so tweet away to your heart's content. I think what we often hear from clients and agency planners alike is that they love out-of-home, they love the channel. But if we're also honest, they've had a real challenge to try and quantify its effectiveness previously. And I think without proven accountability, that love of out-of-home can actually often be overruled by a CFO spreadsheet. So the aim of today really is hopefully to impart some new knowledge, to definitely challenge some of that current thinking, and really quantify the effectiveness of out-of-home in a way that we hope will actually encourage and support investment in a way that maybe econometrics can't. So we started with 3 key questions that we wanted to try and understand. The first one, how does out-of-home work? It sounds very simple, I know, but this was about going deeper than those individual campaign pieces of research that we all do so often. This was about fundamentally understanding the core strengths of out-of-home and how it actually influences people. Secondly, we wanted to understand how effective are campaigns that use out of home versus those that don't. And again, really important, we wanted to quantify this in those hard business metrics, not click-through rates, not kind of those soft intermediary measures, but something that's actually hard and meaningful to a business outcome. And third and finally, how does out of home amplify other media? So again, that point about standing on the shoulders of giants. We wanted to explore how outdoor works with different media. Does it work with all media? Does it work in different ways? So in order to try and answer, obviously, these really ambitious questions, we needed an incredibly robust data source. The IPA have been running the Effectiveness Awards now for over 30 years, and their data bank contains over 2,000 case studies across a variety of sectors, and it provides a wealth of market data, of campaign research, of sales performance, and even of profit analysis. But the really important thing about the data bank is that it's in a comparable format. So what that means is that it allows us to actually understand and examine the type of brand, the size of brand, the objectives and the strategy of the campaign. It allows us to look at the media used, the duration and the budget of the campaign, and then importantly, those effectiveness metrics in terms of brand, in terms of long-term business effects, and also short-term sales activation. We felt that obviously by being able to look at both the brand performance, but actually also more importantly those hard business metrics, that this was actually a unique data set from which we'd be able to actually look for our answers. Now clearly the vast array of data that was in this data bank and the complexity of analysing it, we turned to the Rolls-Royce of analysts, Peter Field. For anyone not familiar with Peter, he's one of the world's leading marketing effectiveness gurus. I think it's fair to say that Peter is probably the most experienced person in actually mining specifically the IPA data bank, and therefore he was the really obvious choice, and we feel very privileged to have had him working on this project. So I'm just going to hand you over to Ross now to talk through some of the methodology.
Thank you. So with thousands of studies available within the data bank, some of which date back more than 30 years, what was our approach to make sense of all this data in order that we could begin to interrogate it? Firstly, owing to the changes in media consumption, in particular the advent and in growth of online and social, we focused only on those studies dating between 2004 to 2016. Secondly, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the statistic that 90% of the top 100 advertisers used out of home in some form. It therefore stands to reason that the majority of studies within the data bank would include out of home in some way, shape or form. However, given that we needed to identify and isolate the impact of using out of home as part of your marketing and media strategy, we needed to identify those campaigns where out of home didn't just feature, but where it represented a significant percentage of your total media investment. For that reason, campaigns where 15% or more of their media budget was invested in out of home became our power users. 15% was selected not as an arbitrary number, but as a figure roughly double that of standard out of home investment. These group of 55 power users were then compared to 92 instances within the data bank where there was no advertising spend across out of home. This gave us a really clear and demonstrable comparison between the effects of using out of home and not using out of home. And by focusing on these extremes, we were actually able to ignore all that mush and all that noise in the middle, as Peter alluded to it, to provide a very clear, simple, and what we hope is a very powerful understanding of what the role of using out of home has upon those brand and business outcomes that Paul mentioned earlier. Before we get into the results, though, we think it's only right to highlight some of the limitations and some of the constraints of our approach. Over the years, Peter and his colleagues have identified a range of key characteristics which act as a measure for greater effectiveness. The first and most important of these is a low extra share of voice, which is widely regarded to or outperform market share. The second disadvantage is a lower use of TV, And the third and final disadvantage for our power users is the fact that there appears to be a greater focus on short-term studies. In comparison, the sole advantage of our approach is a greater number of service sector brands. However, given that the service sector makes up approximately 80% of the UK economy, we don't actually believe that this unduly disadvantages or advantages the study one way or the other. So now that the methodology is out of the way, it's on to the results. The first of which relates to the way in which those most effective brands are using out of home. After all, who better to learn from than those brands that have not only supplied the IPA with the hard business measurements associated with their campaigns, but those that have been recognised and rewarded for their achievements in this field. So given what we know, or certainly what we thought we knew before we commissioned this study, I think we fully expected the instances of brand building to dominate the data bank. So it came as somewhat of a surprise, I think, to learn that over half, 52% of the studies to be precise, featured a sales activation message of some shape or form. Given that out of home is widely believed, or it's widely assumed to deliver those brand building, those soft to mid-term measures of awareness, perception and consideration, but maybe not necessarily deliver against sales in the short term, I think it really caused us to reassess what we thought we knew and perhaps think about what we could learn from the rest of the data bank in terms of the way in which out of home works and its role within that wider communications mix. So in spite of our surprise at the frequency with which brands were using out of home as a sales activation tool, I think it came as somewhat of a relief that everything we thought we knew wasn't completely false. So when Peter began to interrogate the data and discovered that the brand effects out of home were most influencing were fame and esteem, it kind of confirmed some of those thoughts that we already thought we knew. So fame and esteem see uplifts in 32 and 41% respectively. In case you're wondering or thinking that fame and esteem sound quite similar, they're actually working in quite different and quite nuanced ways. So the IPA defines fame as working firstly to increase the noticeability of your brand, and it then increases the prominence with which it features in conversation. The role of esteem then comes to the fore, increasing belief in your brand and increasing the levels of quality and service associated with it. And I think it was really pleasing for us to see that out of home didn't just seem to be having an impact upon these brand effects, but it was also really helping to deliver against those stronger long-term business results. Measurements which perhaps haven't often been associated with out of home in the past. And the impact was so great amongst power users that it is actually performing across not just one, but 3 key measures. The first of these was customer acquisition. So customer acquisition and customers in general are the lifeblood of any organisation. Without customers, you can't make any money. Without acquiring new customers, you can't continue to grow or prosper. In fact, without any customers, you would cease to have a business at all. However, the fact that we also see really positive, meaningful and significant uplifts across those more secure measures of kind of business success, which are profit and market share, we think really goes a long way to validating the increase in customer acquisition you see before you, as it's not necessarily been earned purely via short-term tactics such as price promotion and discounting. With regards to profit, I think you'll all be familiar with the idea of return on marketing investment. And while it's a familiar and a valuable output associated with econometrics, it shouldn't actually be used as a means to set marketing budgets. And that's because it's a measure of marketing efficiency and isn't necessarily indicative of the net profit earned, which is a far greater measure of marketing effectiveness. In addition to profit, and in fact the most significant uplift of all, is market share. Market share is widely regarded to be the most important measurement or form of business result for brands, because it allows you to not only understand your performance versus your competitors, but to understand what your consumers or the way in which your consumers are behaving, as well as understanding whether a market may be in profit or growth or decline. For that reason, and I think the fact that we see such meaningful and significant uplifts across all three of these key long-term business results, we believe it really speaks of the power and influence out of home can have in helping you to achieve those long-term business results. So in spite of the impact and we believe the power of the findings on that last slide, one of the ways I think we were most surprised by the insights from Peter's research was the fact that power users of out of home reported a 47% uplift in sales activation effects when compared to non-users. It's not that we were necessarily surprised to learn that out of home can help to increase sales, but it's the magnitude and the size to which they increase those sales. As probably prior to this research, we assumed that they grew sales, albeit at that slower, more sustainable rate associated with brand building. All of which perhaps makes the findings on this next slide seem a little bit obvious. However, we think there's a very clear and a very important message within that. And that is that if your objective, or certainly the way in which you're going to analyse the performance of your campaign is via sales, that by running a brand building in place of a sales activation focused message, you're effectively halving your chances of success. It stands to reason, therefore, that the similar levels of scrutiny should be applied to both the strategy, the media, and the messaging used, as while a brand building campaign will increase short-term sales by up to 28%, and the inclusion of sales activation will see further boosts to that. If the sole objective of your campaign is to increase sales, then a message focused solely or entirely on sales activation will double the number of very large activation effects. I think all of this really serves the need for clarity when not only determining what the role for media is, but for when determining how you intend to evaluate the performance of your campaign. So I think in spite of what we've learned over the last couple of slides about the role of sales activation, it's often portrayed as the poorer relation in the brand versus sales activation dynamic. It's fascinating, therefore, to see that it appears to be contributing more than the sum of its parts. So much so that when brand and sales are used in conjunction with one another, it doubles the number of long-term brand and business results. Given how difficult it can be to effectively change consumers' attitudes and behaviours over the long term, the fact that brand building alone increases the number of brand and business effects by an average of 1 is a phenomenal performance. The fact that the inclusion of sales activation tactics on top of this appears to be turbocharging performance, we believe speaks of the need for best practice in out of home if you wish to achieve optimal performance.
So if we cast our minds back again to those first questions that we had, one of them was about understanding how out-of-home works in conjunction with other media. And the data bank allows us to interrogate that and see how they come together. So pleasingly, we found that out-of-home was actually working to boost the business effects of all the major traditional media channels. So you can see here a moderate uplift of 7% against press, but actually a significant uplift to the business effects of both radio and TV by up to 17%. But actually, what the data bank indicated was that out-of-home's ability to amplify was actually strongest on digital channels. Out-of-home is boosting the business effects of paid social by 20% and actually search by a whopping 54%. A point to note here that search generally benefits from fame. Obviously, if your brand is being talked about, then there's a spike in search activity. So it stands to reason then that obviously out-of-home's ability to generate and to drive brand fame is one of the reasons why it's significantly influencing the business effectiveness of search. And I think you'll agree that obviously if this channel can actually influence and enhance the business effects of the likes of Google and Facebook, then obviously we're in a pretty good place. In our quest, though, to try and understand how out-of-home actually was working, two themes started to emerge. So within the data bank and within our cells that we were looking at, first of all, we started to see that there was a number of big brands with big budgets who were using out-of-home and TV as the core part to their media mix. But then on the opposite end of the scale, we actually discovered that there were a number of challenger brands with smaller budgets who were actually using out-of-home as a substitute for TV. And I think those particular brands, obviously they have less media pounds at their disposal. So what we found is that they were tending to use digital and out-of-home in combination as their kind of core media channels, with out-of-home's role specifically there to try and boost the visibility of the campaign. So from our perspective, the differing uses of these media tactics really gave us an opportunity to actually understand how specifically out-of-home is working differently with different media channels. So the first thing that kind of Peter found when he was looking at how out-of-home is working with TV was the fact that it's actually helping to influence a number of key brand metrics. So actually, for those brands that are using out-of-home power users, they're actually seeing these uplifts to their TV brand effects of fame and esteem being the core ones, obviously a significant 72 and 64% uplift. And I think what the research found was that it really kind of screamed out that if you're looking for your brand to be famous, then out-of-home and TV working in combination are the two best channels to deliver this. But then we contrasted this to how out-of-home was actually working with social. So unlike with TV, where we didn't see any real uplift in awareness, that isn't the case with social. So first and foremost, actually the use of out-of-home is actually helping to boost awareness of paid social activity. Then those core strengths of out-of-home again are coming to the fore, helping to drive fame and esteem. So again, that brand quality. But I think what we really found now was that it was actually the stature of out-of-home that social appeared to benefit the most from. What was really interesting was to see the effects that out-of-home had on brand trust when it was being used with and to support social media. I think from our perspective, one of the things that we took out of this was that the public nature and the stature of the out-of-home medium was helping to actually drive credibility and trust in a way that social can't achieve in its own right. So having looked at those brand effects, we also wanted to see how these uplifts correlated to those hard business metrics that we've talked about throughout. And again, first of all, if we look at TV, so as we've seen on countless kind of occasions previously and in different studies, that power of brand fame is incredibly important to drive significant long-term business effects. So again, the combination of TV and out-of-home working together to drive brand fame, it was of no real surprise to see a significant boost to the business effects of television, specifically around those kind of key business growth areas of customer acquisition, profit and market share. Now, out-of-home is still working in the same way with social, again, to boost that market share metric. Now, as you can see, obviously that's a significantly higher result than with TV, but this can be explained by the fact that going back to the study and the data bank that we're using, the power users, the out-of-home power users that are working with social tend to be smaller brands and therefore they have more growth potential. So it's far easier to obviously deliver a 170% uplift in a market share of, say, 2% market share than it would be with a bigger brand with 15% share. So that's one of the reasons why we see such a significant uplift with social. That's not to diminish the power of the results, but it is the reason behind it. The other thing, though, that I think was really then interesting, so far we're seeing similarities between how out-of-home is working with both channels, but next we see that actually the business effects that out-of-home is helping to influence with social is actually price sensitivity and customer loyalty. And that's obviously very, very different to how it's working with out-of-home. With TV. And I think really for us, it was the collection of all of this data together that was the really interesting part, because actually what it points to is that out of home is an incredibly versatile channel. Janet mentioned this at the start in her introduction, but it's actually almost unique in the sense of all media channels in the fact that it has the ability to drive brand, it has the ability to do sales activation, but we can see here that it is working with all media channels but in very, very different ways, and I think it's that versatility of out of home that is so intriguing. So if we remind ourselves of those three key questions that we started with, how does out of home work, how effective is it, and how does it amplify other media? I think we hopefully have got three very clear answers. Out of home works by adding stature and fame to campaigns. Ultimately, it gets your brand talked about and it helps to enhance the perception of brand quality. Secondly, we find that those brands that are out of home power users are ultimately delivering much stronger and harder business outcomes and effects, specifically around those key business growth areas of profit, market share and customer acquisition. And finally, we see that out of home does amplify the business effects of all other media, but specifically those digital channels of social and search. So, if you're all still with us, I think it's Q&A time.
Yes, well, I mean, hopefully you've all learned something new today, and we've given you some food for thought to take away. The presentation is available in its entirety on our website, rapportww.com. There you go. But it really just remains for me to open up to the floor for questions. So please, if you have anything for Ross, for Paul, or for Janet, please ask away. Good.
Thanks, guys. I thought it was really, really good, really compelling piece. 2004 to 2016, did you see any trends around the effectiveness of out of home over that period?
So, do you want me to pick this one up?
Yeah.
So we didn't break that analysis down within that period. We needed a robust enough set that would allow us to look at all those other metrics. But actually, one of the separate pieces that wasn't our commissions, but again, actually that Janet mentioned in the media in focus. So Peter has done some separate work, and he's looked more recently in the last few years at the data bank, specifically within out of home. And what it's indicating as a top line finding is that actually campaigns that are incorporating digital out of home within the media mix are delivering almost double the number again of those long-term business effects that we're seeing. So it does look as though the advent of digital out of home, so those recent years, is again helping to kind of improve the effectiveness even further.
No, I suspect that. You've got avoidance of other media and obviously you've got the growth of social. So.
Good. Anybody else? Okay, yes.
One question, great piece in there. It's great to finally be able to quantify some of that and using the IPA central. What is the plan in terms of taking this above and beyond? Obviously, a great kick-off today. It's such a great piece of research. What are your plans to amplify this above and beyond today?
I mean, the first thing to say is that we see this as being a very collaborative piece of work. We started in sort of 2004, but actually, there's a very, very rich data bank which goes back much further than that. So, everybody here in some way has contributed towards the research. So, it's on our website. Root are here, Outsmart are here. Our partners are here as well, the vendors, and we want everybody to use this because we think it's an amazing piece of research and it's really going to help us all. So, coming back to something which I touched on earlier, out of home is growing. It's in really, really good health, and I think this can only really help to increase that. So, I mean, in terms of a specific plan, we'll have things that we will do individually, but I mean, I wanted to start by saying that this is really about collaboration, and it's available to everybody.
I think again the primary thing for us on this was genuinely to try and improve, obviously, the effectiveness of communications in out of home. So from our perspective, what we're really looking to do is engage as many of our agency planners and our clients as possible. And it's an education session. You know, there were some things in here that we found that we knew that were surprising, that we didn't have all the answers to. So from our perspective, our rollout plan, if you like, is to just engage as many of our agency and client community as possible, to allow them to see the research, to allow them to ask any questions that they have, and then obviously to try and improve the effects that they see from the medium.
Well, Chris, thank you for a great presentation, guys. In my FEPI role, international role, are you going to be sharing this around your network of offices as well, for what it's worth in terms of translation to other markets?
Yes, and I can also reveal that we will be revealing an international version of this as well. So obviously the data bank is primarily a UK-based data bank, so the majority of the cases within are UK-based, but actually they have a worldwide pull, and the number of effectiveness awards that come in from all over the world is still vast. So one of the things that we did in parallel to this was actually we introduced those international out-of-home studies as well. Now obviously it's not rich from a local market perspective, it wouldn't be robust enough from there, but there were some really interesting findings and parallels between the findings in the UK still apply to the rest of the world as well. So we will be releasing a version 2 which will be aimed at international, and of course we'll be sharing that with our markets.
Thank you. Well, please let me know so we can help pimp it when you do it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, look. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. It just remains me to thank Peter Field, who's not here, and Janet, obviously, which was a very big part of this presentation. But thank you very much for coming.